Hey, one. All right. Get it set up here. Make sure going on. All right. Kids allowed. Oh, let's see here. Western stories. Texas Rangers. Rangers. Right. Okay. Okay. Live. Okay. Reading. Hey, Gibbo. Cool. Story about Texas Rangers. Follow me to hell. Uh, and different. Tom Clavin, who wrote this story, all these different stories. The Last Tale, to the ultimate most end of the earth story. So, yeah, I've been watching your show since I can't. You got your members going on. So that's the story. In the memory of Brandon Clavin, to his son. Texas Devils, Chapter 1. Author's note. To some of the readers may be aware that I am an author or co-author of a whole wagon train of books that are inhabited by a wide array of wonderful real life characters. But writing about Linder McNally was a special challenge. Let me amend that. Writing about the Texas Rangers was a special challenge. And then there was McNally on the top of that list. Hey Aurora, how you doing? This book is not intended to be a history of the Texas Rangers. However, set the stage for the ventures of McNally Rangers in the mid 1870s. It seems including as much history of the Rangers as readers would tolerate and was necessary. What made this additional challenging was that one could consult and say three sources of information on the Texas Rangers and be presented with three different versions of same event. Just one sample is the Texan Karinawa fight. Uh, Karina Ka, or I think the Indian name, fight to the Skull Creek. Oh, thanks, Gibbo. Never forget. Which is said to be have involved anywhere from 11 to 25 Texans and have to be taken place in the late 1822 or February 1823. Such traditions I have often found can be attributed to accounts probably not the most reliable eyewitness on frontier, rather the frontier is Kentucky, Kansas, Arizona, and Texas. But the special case of the Texas Rangers, many tales, both tall and small, have been spun during the last 2 centuries by a variety of tellers, and some previous writers have cherry picked the most, let's say, useful ones. Some researchers and writers have made valiant effort to separate the facts as the best they could be determined from fiction, and those are the sources I have tried to pay the most attention to. Because this book is not necessarily a history of the Texas Rangers, not all events and participants leading up to the 1870s have been included using my judgment for better or worse. I have presented an overview of the main event that had impacted the Southeast Texas before the Civil War. And there is Linder McNally. He is one of the more rare figures in Texas Rangers history. However, not only he was the captain of the company for less than 3 years, but also the man he commanded were not technical Rangers, but members of a Washington County volunteer militia. And at least 4 of them wrote about their experience, with each account differing significantly from each other's. These stories do not diminish the archives of McNally's Ranger, but they do indicate that trying to write a true story about them can seem like off on the story of the task. But it was one worth undertaking. I am not contending that McNally was the greatest Ranger captain. Very strong arguments have been made on behalf of John Coffey Hayes, John Rip Ford, and John B. Jones, among those, but many Texas Ranger historians will agree that Linder McNally was a transcendental figure. He represents both the old Rangers' ways and the new Rangers' way, and evolved into the modern police force of today. McNally was, without question, the most epic Ranger captain of the mid 1870s. When his transition began, as Frederick Wilson points out in his description, able to law comes to Texas. The Ranger of the 1870s and following decades were little changed from the man of 1840s and 1850s. And one basic improvement: for the first time, a Ranger force was permanently established. This prospect of permanently correct and defined in all of the earlier Rangers units. Experience, creed of the Rangers was maintained in service. Frontier justice has arrived. One might think that McNally, given his structure in the Texas Rangers history, was a formidable figure who was very present, caused evildoers to surrender. This is not true physical. He was barely 5'5" at 125 pounds, dressed almost like a dandy, bush jacket, duck pants, calf skin leggings, sometimes a bear hat, and wear his long beard neatly trimmed. However, his men occasionally referred him to Little McNally, and the newspaper accounts follows him because of the force of his personality, devotion to law and order. As he saw it, he undeniable courage. He was indeed one of a kind. One more note about the Follow Me to Hell. The Indians was in common use during the decades that I'm writing about, but it's also nearly a common today. To this author, the word Indian is not by itself derogatory when used as a definition of America's inhabitants. Still, I have endeavored to use, as often possible, person, name, or tribal affection to keep uses of Indian to the minimum. Okay, now that we got this out of the way, let's pretend we're gathering around the campfire and tell a legendary people, especially Linder McNally, is about to be told. Prologue. It was a bright, young, unusual, mild, light autumn morning when the man known as McNally Rangers rode away from Richard King's ranch and fresh horses. And for those who need saddles at brisk pace, the riders searched for vengeance and bandits who had terrorized a town. Their captain was Linder McNally. Most description of him echoes that Doug Swanson in his book Cult of the Glory. He was short, grunt, thin of voice, and racked by tuberculous sickness. To a newspaper correspondent of his days, he appeared as the very reserved, robust one of his own men. A Meyer described him as sick and sick and a little runt of full filler. At the peak of his career, he was sometimes so weak he could barely stand. But his company of Rangers would obey his every word and display as much bravery in action as he did. Now, in November 1875, they were undertaking their most dangerous mission yet. To enforce the law, they might have to go south of the Rio Grande, even if an invasion of Mexico triggered a war. As they neared the border, McNally told his men to stop and rest and double-check their pistols, rifles, and ammunition while they are at it. They did so, and they drink from their canteens, mop their weather-beaten faces, and radiate themselves for arriving at the river. Once the Rangers were rested enough and prepared to get on with their new mounts, their captain addressed them. "Boys," McNally began, "I may lead you into hell, but I'll get you out of it if you do exactly as I tell you to. I'll never send you into battle. I'll lead you. All I ask any men to do is follow me." The 40 men climbed up on their saddles, formed a line behind their captain, and head south. Once in the sight of Rio Grande, in the hospitality terrain beyond, many of McNally's Rangers wonder if this was only their first view of hell, and there inches their horses closer to the captain. The colonists and the captain. No man in the wrong can stand up against a fellow that's in the right or keep on coming. Ranger Captain Bill McDaniel. Chapter 1. Texas Devil. It's generally agreed that Stephen Austin created the Texas Rangers a few strokes of his quill pen in August 1823. And this call to arms, he did indeed use the word Rangers. But before this mass, there already were Rangers in Texas. It would take 2 years before Austin Group were called Texas Rangers. When Anglo settlers first arrived in 1821 and began to put roots down in the fertile soil of the eastern section of Spanish Texas, the most serious threat they faced was to be the tribe known as Karen, the Indian tribe. Like I said, I don't know how to say it. There were close to 2,000 members of the tribe spread out between Galveston Bay and Corpus Christi Bay. They have fearsome reputation. Properly, they practiced cannibalism with capture and kill enemies. And it appears a few white men had an encounter before the Indians, this Indian tribe. Men were all tall and muscular. During the summer, they rode. Deerskin, beach clothes, or nothing at all, and in the winter they donned buffalo and deer robes. Their bodies were painted and tattooed and pierced with small pieces of cane. They often smeared themselves with a mixture of mud and alligator and shark grease to wear off the mosquitoes. The women also painted and tattooed their bodies and wore knee-length shirts of animal skins. An anal settler suddenly appeared with a mission to establish ranch and farm in traditional hunting grounds. Were not greeted warmly by this Indian tribe. Immediately there was conflict. One incident resulted in the death of two Anglo or Texans. As they began to be called, they were attacked and killed as they were transporting corn on the raft up the Colorado River. Now, Robert Kendall, Kentuckian, who was one of the original Anglo settlers, called upon 24 of other colonists to join him in the revenge ride. They knew this Indian tribe had a camp in territory of the Colorado River known as Skull Creek, and that's where the whole ride went. Now, this Indian tribe, indeed, the colonists stealthily approached, and after a quiet preparation of the weapons, they attacked, caught completely by surprise. The tribe, men, women, and children tried to flee. Many couldn't outrun the Texans' long rifles. When the firing stopped, there were between 19 to 23 of these Indian bodies left behind. The battle would turn out to be the first of many between the Texans and the native inhabitants during the next 6 decades. Having been successful in their first foray, Kendall and other colonist leader John Jackson Tomlinson, for though it was good idea to have sort of militia always ready for the future publication, the Mexican government approved in 1823 saw the establishment of 10-man unit to be led by Moses Morrison, who had served in the United States Army. They were not technically Rangers, but pretty much served as such until Stephen Austin gave them a name. The original purpose would expand and include battling interloping Mexican cattle rustlers and other lumped together as bandits or border ruffians. Many Mexicans soon come to calling them Los Dobles, the Texas Devils. In August 1823, Stephen Austin resided at the Colonel. He had established the Colorado River in Spanish Texas. Now, the colony contained the coastal prairie good for grazing and farming. He noted in his diary, "The country is most beautiful and desire to live in I ever saw." But looking past the beauty of Austin could clearly see the danger. He was becoming increasingly alarmed because, as he wrote to the local authorities, the roads are full of arrogant thieves united with Indians, which the authorities apparently helpless to protect their own citizens, let alone newcomers. American settlers, Austin took matters into his own hands. He wrote and issued a plea for a man with their own horses and guns to gather as a sort of militia. Austin vowed to pay $15 a month to each man. However, because he was strapped as for cash, his offer rally was that each month a volunteer would earn $15 worth of land at that time. The only thing Stephen Austin had a lot of in addition to travel was land. Most significant about his call to arms was Austin's writing that men were being sought in the active Rangers for the common defense. By 1823, North American militia was well known entirely, but for the first time in Texas documents the word Rangers was used. To this day, it is one of the most familiar words associated with Texas. Luckless liberators. freedom fighters. One reason for the military impatience of Mexico on its northern border was that it had only recently wasted itself free from Spain and had plenty of potential financial housekeeping to do. Mexico had to worry much more about repelling the invasion of Spain than the safety of Texas. Now, Spain had not immediately joined France early 1778 to enter the Revolutionary War on the side of the American. It was not quite strong military as France, and it took more seriously than its neighbor in possible consequences of supporting insurgents again in Monarch. Eventually, through Spain provided some significant assistance to rebelling English colonists, much of its thanks to Bernard de Glasso, sorry to say, Bernard, the governor of Louisiana, barely in his 30s, eager embraced Spain's somewhat reluctant decision in June 1779. To reorganize the United States as the independent nation, Bernard used his soldiers to thwart British attempts to close the Mississippi River, which allowed the transport goods and raw materials to eventually find their way into the colonies. Along the East Coast, some of its ports having been blockaded by the British, and Bernard led a campaign east that threw the British off of the west coast of Florida, a satisfying revenge for the British having taken Florida from Spain 2 decades earlier. But the biggest benefit Bernard had for Texas was the creation of the cattle drive to feed his troops as they pursued a disheartening redcoat back from the Baton Rouge to Natchez, to Mobile, or Pensacola. Now, Brandon purchased 2,000 heads from the rancher San Antonio area, who had driven them north and east. The cattle drive continued until hostile again. The British ended in 1782. Now, effectively, these dirty, dusty tracks demonstrate the ranching in Texas and moving thousands of tons of beef to available market could work. The British, suddenly there was a rush of Spanish Mexicans wanting to become ranchers. The government made it easier to do so by granting a square league of 4,428 acres to every man who paid a fee and to raise the stock. In San Antonio region, especially, that the stock was cattle with so much grazing and available for each owner farming and more risky and low return enterprise. After the war, ranching like the way prosper and many men did. Governor Brando, through only age 40, died in November 1786, and those did not live to prosperity regret the help he had given to American cause. With the United States growing the productive and confidential by leaps and bounds, Spanish authorities in Mexico began to wonder how expand the former colonists would become. Now, recent nation economic season soon outpaced that of the new Spanish territory, becoming twice as productive by 1800s. The population trend looked rather worrisome too. In 1790, the United States population was 3.7 million, and the Mexican was 4.8 million. But half of Mexico population was comprised by Indians, who, unlike the Americans, were dwindling in the numbers and did not contribute much to the as numbers of Americans grew. They would expanding out to new territories, which includes west and south of the Mississippi River. Spanish authorities were right to be nervous about northern intruders, a warning of what was to come. For now, Mexican can be found in the brief but mysterious career of Philip Nolan. He had been born in Belfast, Ireland in 1771. By the late 1780s, teenager was in New Orleans as a bookkeeper for the trader James Wilkinson, who did much of his business with Spanish merchants and lawmakers, having learned to speak Spanish frequently by 20. Nolan secured trading passports for all the Spanish governors of Louisiana and set out trade for the Indian tribe across the Mississippi River. Now, Nolan either overlooked or ignored the passport as they void in the Spanish Texas, and his goods was taken by the Spanish authorities. Before returning to New Orleans, he leaves with the Indians for 2 years. Thanks to the treaty with them, Nolan had at least 50 wild horses with him when he got back. He made a second trip to Texas in 1794 and another passport from Louisiana governor. He made acquaintances with Spain Texas Governor Manuel Menendez and the Commandant General of the province of Pedro de Pedro de Val, something, through the offering more promises. Nolan was sending packages again, but the time he had 250 horses trailing behind him. 3 years later, in the summer of 1797, Nolan left for Spanish Texas with a wagon train of goods which for trade, and he successfully brought to San Antonio, where he tried to insinuate himself in a local society. He was instead given a one-way ticket out of Texas. Nolan arrived in Natchez with several hundred of more horses. He should have quite to enjoy the process from all selling the horses, especially after he was unable to obtain any more passport. Now, instead of Nolan pursued with 30 frontiersmen to accompany him to Spain, Texas, where they would seize riches and land and create kingdom for themselves. The expedition crossed the border in October 1800. And headed north to Nacogdoches, to capture wild mustangs. Now, the Spanish soon heard of their activities, created their own expedition. The following March, a Spanish force of 120 men left Nacogdoches. They encountered Nolan and his followers just upstream from where the current Nolan River flows into the large Brazos River. Several of the Americans surrounded immediately to the Spanish. Nolan did not, and he was killed. His ears were cut off as evidence for authorities back in Mexico City that he was dead. After Nolan was dead, some of his followers continued to fight until they were promised safe passage to return to Louisiana. First, however, they were taken into Mexico, where authorities decreed one of the men must die for their resistance. After death were cast, unlucky Ephraim Blackburn was hung. The others were not sent to Louisiana back, but spent several years being rotated among several Mexican prisons. Politics landscape changed in 1803. Now, Louisiana purchased President Thomas Jefferson acquisition of 820,000 square feet meant even more far range exploring. The Texas was not part of the transaction, but it was only fine print to the hunters, farmers, and other looking to hike and ride towards new horizon. In addition, a few Spanish authorities had the idea of encouraging Indian tribes to move south to Texas. They could roam freely to hunt, and the presence would teeter on white American ventures. How long this might work become moot when Mexican began to catch the revolution fever. It had begun back in the homeland because it really could not effectively do otherwise in Spain. Now it was unclear what happened to the rest of the Irishman body. However, in 1949, Reverend Ray Kendall, a descendant of Robert Kendall and Joseph Price, who had settled on the Dixon Grant along the Mustang Creek, found a flat weather stone upon which crude and carved scarce of memory of Nolan had gone along the Napoleon quest to become the ruler of Europe. But in 1808, he determined that the corporation was nearly as endurable as conquest attacked Spain. It was not long before King Charles, and his son Ferdinand were removed from their throne and replaced by Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother. Subsequently, war resistance in Spain caused ripples in Mexico, where many of the resistance of politic leaders and those who wanted to be were not fighting French occupy, but each other in the process. They moved away from Spanish supervision altogether. One would be a ruler of independent of Mexico, Manuel Hodega Castile. His defeat and execution in the summer of 1811 by force royal Spain was one of the several attempts to liberate Mexico. And another revolution later was Juan Batiste, whose demise that some years was more gruesome. He was shot, decapitated, and was a warning to other rebels. His head was put on a display in the plaza of San Antonio. Such grisly conclusion to the revolution effort do not end the fight among the various fractions. And what had spilled into Mexico splashed on Spanish Texas too. A blacksmith with bigger ambitions than shoeing horses, Bernard believed he could succeed, in other he failed. Displaying plenty of his travel to Washington, D.C., and was not only granted a meeting with James Monroe, but also encouraged by Secretary of State to stir up things back home. Let's see here, stir up things back home. Where am I? Okay. This Gortys recruiting army that on March 28, 1813, defeated the royalist force of Battle of Salado. 4 days later, Gortys arrived in Santa Antonio. Trying to speak. Sorry about that. Hold on. Cool. That's cool. Gilbo, that's great. That one needs to be closed down too. That case needs to be solved. It needs to be done. San Antonio and declare himself the head of the new government and to be the safe side. He had a dozen or so leaders of the army he defeated brought back to Salado Creek, where we hacked to death. On April 6th, Cortez proclaimed Texas independence. By August, Cortez had vacated his command and was gone, and more fighting ensued because of this dazzling array of leaders, aristocrats common by loyalists and insurgents, plus the death of a few Americans who had rushly fought for the independence. The United States government washed its hands of Texas, but to annoy it, especially given that there were millions of acres to be north to be explored, tamed, and settled. Once the native inhabitants were brushed aside to make things official, the Secretary of State in the new Monroe administration, John Quincy Adams, Luis de Onís, Spain minister to the United States, negotiate a treaty in 1819 that ceded Florida to the United States and defined the Red and Southern River as the boundary between the United States and New Spain, which include Texas, that should calm things down, at least as far as American ambitions were concerned. By living in quiet, unrevelation life, Cortez escaped the stomach of churning death of another rebellious leader, not passing away until May 1841, 3 months before his 67th birthday. Well, I'm going to stop there. And the next chapter, chapter 3, The Long Republic. So that's it. Hey, thanks for all coming. I'm glad I got you on here now, Gibbo and Aurora. Thanks for coming too. Get people come on here, and I'm glad you're all coming. Be able to see y'all and stuff. So y'all have a nice evening now. All right. Talk to you later. Bye now.